Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our specialist seminar, Extreme Heritage, Climate Change, Risk and Resilience. It's wonderful to see so many of you with us here tonight. Please do say hello in the chat and let us know where you're joining from. We'd love to get to know who's here. Tonight's event is very kindly supported by the Green Overseas Programme, and we're grateful for their support in helping us all to be here together and have this really engaging and exciting chat. So before we get started, a reminder that tonight's session, along with all of the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust's previous webinars, will be available to watch on the UKAHT YouTube channel. And as we go along, please post your questions into the chat and we'll bring those into the question and answer session at the end. So as they come to you, do pop them in and I'll give you another reminder towards the end of our panel. So my name is Ruth Mullett. I'm the Head of Buildings and Conservation for the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust. And I have the great pleasure and honour of hosting tonight's panel of expert speakers, where together we will explore the threats posed to heritage sites by a changing climate, and also explore what the heritage sector is doing to try and meet some of these challenges. So I'm pleased to introduce our panellists for the discussion tonight, starting with Gord MacDonald, who is a designer, builder and building conservator whose work has taken him across to 6 continents. His projects span from restoring medieval castles to spending over a year working on the ice down in Antarctica. He teaches on the International Wood Conservation course in Norway and represents Canada on several ICOMOS committees. He also currently serves as the president of the International Polar Heritage Committee. So welcome, Gord.
Hi, Ruth. Good afternoon.
And secondly, we have Marcy Rockman, who is an archaeologist who specialises in the relationship between heritage and climate change. So her work focuses on how people learn from their landscapes, and she's applied this research in settings that range from cultural resource management in the American West to homeland security risk in Washington, DC. Marcy served as the first climate change adaptation coordinator for cultural resources at the US National Park Service and has since worked with organisations such as IPCC and ICROM. She is now a visiting researcher at Linnaeus University in Sweden and contributes to the UNESCO Chair on Heritage Futures. So welcome to you, Marcy. Thank you for joining us. And finally, we have Hannah Fluck, who is a British archaeologist with over 20 years experience in heritage management and a specialism in climate change and heritage policy. She previously led Historic England's climate work, authoring key national reports and helping shape UK policy, and is the founding steering committee member of the Climate Heritage Network. Hannah is now Senior National Archaeologist at the National Trust and contributes widely to major research projects and climate-related heritage initiatives. So welcome to you, Hannah.
Thank you.
It's really wonderful to have you all here. Thank you so much. So each of our speakers here tonight brings a different perspective, but together I think we all think deeply and regularly about the relationship between climate change and heritage. And this is a topic that's very real and present for us at the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust. Our sites down in Antarctica tell the story of the very beginnings of climate science, and yet today they are the victims of that changing climate. And what we're seeing in managing our conservation programme is a real rapid acceleration of impacts from things like increased snow loading, damaging vulnerable structures, to meltwater eroding foundations, and significant changes to the landscapes in which these sites sit. And each season we're trying to find ways to work and understand how we can build resilience in this heritage space. So Gord, I thought perhaps we could start with you. Through the Green Overseas Programme, you and I have been working recently on a topic to try and assess risk to heritage in Antarctica, and a place where change is very rapid and very visible. Can you set the scene for us a bit? Can you tell us what it is we're trying to understand about Antarctica and why these insights might matter globally to everybody in this space tonight?
Sure. I think probably it helps to set a bit of context. With Antarctica, we've got to remember that most of the cultural heritage is clustered in a very narrow band around the coastline, because, of course, that's how people first arrived on the continent. The other thing to remember about the Antarctic context is that the history is relatively new and the archaeology is quite small. So we're talking about mid to late 18th century through into the 19th century and some early 20th century culture. And that being clustered around the edge of the coastline makes the cultural sites in Antarctica particularly relevant to climate change, because, of course, that's where most of the exciting stuff is going on. Antarctica's warming and thawing, and as well from popular press, the ice sheets are melting and freshening the seas around them. That has an immediate impact on the cultural sites in Antarctica. And probably the biggest impact of all is that the sea ice conditions are changing. And sea ice in Antarctica provides a buffer to a lot of these coastal sites. And with sea ice thinning and the sea ice margins retracting, the coastlines are much more vulnerable to storms, which are under impact of a changing climate.
Thanks, Gord. Can you tell us just a little bit more about the work of the particular project this past season? What is the climate change risk assessment tool, and how is it going to be used?
So over the past couple of years, we've been developing an interactive model which is intended to be used by managers of historic sites in Antarctica to make a preliminary risk assessment. This is really useful for managers who are responsible for multiple sites like the UKAHT or the Trust in New Zealand, etc. And many of the national Antarctic programs share these responsibilities. So the tool that we've developed works by inputting information which is publicly available through the Antarctic Protected Areas database, and it produces a relative risk value, which is based on the vulnerability of the site and the likelihood that it will experience climate change impacts. So the model was developed originally in the Ross Sea with a group of sites there, and last year through the Go Overseas project, I worked with you, Ruth, and others from the UKAHT to ground truth the model on the other side of the continent, on the west coast of the Antarctic Peninsula. So we visited 6 sites. Each of them are historic sites and monuments protected under the treaty. And here you can see carrying some of this gear around at one of the sites that we were interrogating.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Gord. And Hannah, you've done a lot of work on policy across the UK and more widely, thinking about how the heritage sector is responding to climate change. How would you describe the challenges faced by the heritage sector more broadly? How is the sector currently managing priority and risk, do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting and pretty complex question. I mean, it's essentially the challenges that we face flow from the changes in our climate. In the UK, that's increases in extremes of precipitation, but I think that's something that's experienced in pretty much everywhere. When it rains a lot more and a lot more heavily, and I think any of us that have just lived through the recent UK winter will be feeling that quite acutely. I'm currently sat in Wales, one of the wettest corners of the UK, and it is raining. But also the extremes with periods of drought, and often at times of year when we might not have predicted that. So the loss of that seasonal prediction and the ability to kind of plan for patterns of weather that we're familiar. Also the increasing temperatures. So as increased temperatures, hot air holds more moisture, hence the higher levels of rain, but also the extremes of temperature And certainly the UK, we've had periods of temperatures over 40 degrees, which are not normal. These are not something that we've experienced before. That brings new challenges, particularly inside our buildings, which might not be suitable for being in the way in which they might retain heat. That's proved a particular challenge. And then the ways in which that unpredictability, or indeed the ways in which wind occurs at times of year where perhaps trees are in leaf, so the damage that we get from storms and from windiness can change. And it's not just those direct changes in weather patterns and climate impacts. It's also the ways in which we respond to those and the sort of knock-on effects. And it's part of a system, and we often talk about systems thinking being part of how we need to understand and respond to these changes and challenges. And it does require thinking differently about things that we might ordinarily have done that might have been enabled us to cope with flooding and rainfall. So, for instance, things like the gutters on our buildings that channel how we channel rainwater away from buildings. If you've got a lot more rain falling in one burst, then those start to fail, and we need to rethink and perhaps alter ways that have worked in places often for hundreds of years, actually. So it's quite a challenge. The way that we've always done things might not be the way that we can continue to do things to look after those places and buildings.
Absolutely. That really does resonate with what we are experiencing in Antarctica at the moment, which is buildings which were never designed really for water management at all. They don't have gutters or anything of the kind. Seeing really now large quantities of precipitation, both in the form of rain, but then snow and snow melt, and trying to design solutions that can help the buildings cope with these, whilst of course being sympathetic to the heritage context and the environment. So it's a question that I think is felt, the challenge that's felt by many of us here in the heritage sector in our own ways. Marcy, turning to you, Hannah just mentioned there ways of thinking about the problem differently, and I wonder whether you could reflect on that a little bit. Are there ways that you think we might reframe how we are thinking about climate change and heritage, maybe bringing in sort of thinking about public engagement or policy scenarios?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Gordon. Hannah, I'm delighted to be here. I think as you introduced me, I worked for the National Park Service for a number of years as their lead for climate change and heritage. And one of the frames that we set up there was absolutely climate change is affecting all the places that we designate as heritage. But what I've jumped up and down about ever since is that we also need to make heritage places part of our solutions to climate change. We need to connect them up, and that if we sort of say that they are victims of climate change or they're being damaged, and that's the main focus of how we describe them, in a very practical sense, we'll probably never have enough capacity to really address all of those impacts. But if we can really hitch them up and say, everything that heritage places are, their stories, their inspiration, their memory, their connections, their community, all of the things that they hold in them. And if we really work to make them part of how we are addressing climate change, then we get this wheel to start turning, and we have hopefully a much better chance of working with them and having, this sounds very I'm selfish, but we have the support we need to supply heritage. But I think also the larger response to climate change will also have all that heritage brings with it. So so I jump up now and say there are two parts to heritage and climate. There's understanding the impacts on and addressing those, but also linking all that they are into the larger response to climate change. So
yeah, absolutely. Thinking about the opportunities as I suppose, as well as the as well as recognizing the impacts seems really crucial. I think in our space, in the Antarctic space, we feel that there's a great opportunity in telling the story of climate change, because this is also where some of the climate change was first really sort of understood and began to be studied, and they're holders of data sources that are still used for understanding how the climate is changing currently, and that's really valuable, and the way that we think about that probably has a part to play. You mentioned there, Marcy, thinking about how what do we do when we have so much that needs doing, and so much of a challenge in front of us, but not enough resource necessarily to tackle all the problems. And I think this is something that whatever part of the heritage sector you're in, you feel there's never quite enough resource to achieve everything that we want to achieve. And I think probably all three of you here will have something to say about what do you do when you work in an environment where the problems are really large, resources are really scarce, and you need to decide how to prioritize action. How do you go about that, Marcy?
See, I have there are lots of ways to do it. I think I think there are two ways I would approach this. One is, I think, and Gord introduced this, the sense of doing that really careful prioritization work on the ground of what is the direct measurements of vulnerability, and understanding, what do we know in terms of these particular places and what they're addressing. And then there's the space that I've been working in most recently, which is sort of the policy space, is trying to really dig in and understand how all of these parts are related, and where can we find more movement and more connection to really change the environment that we're in. I always like to say we live in essentially two environments. We live in a physical environment, which is changing with climate change, but we also live in a social environment, and that has its social and economic and political and economic capacities to it. And those aren't always in sync. That is one of our big challenges. And one of the places that I've been diving into is sort of the history of our policy. For example, the history of policy for heritage across much of the global north really took shape over the sort of early to mid 20th century, which was before widespread recognition of climate change. And many of our institutions for climate change took place in the later part of the 20th century into the 21st, and they were really never designed to talk to each other. And so a lot of the work do is, how do you bring those together? And I know there has been work to bring them together, but they often don't stay together. So how does this answer your question is, my concern is like finding those touch points is where are the disconnects, and how can we find new ways to talk about this, and how do we find new partners? So that doesn't immediately bring money into the bank account, but it starts to help us understand where some of our challenges and issues come from. And it can also give us new language and new partners and new ways to tell the story.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gord, you've been thinking about this question too. I mean, part of the purpose of the tool that you've been developing is to help people understand where to put resource, where to undertake further study, never to say that a desk-based tool is enough, but that it can be a starting point to help people understand that the problems that they're faced with. Would you like to speak a little bit about how prioritization works for you?
Sure. I mean, as Marcy said, we need to start by getting our arms around the problem and understanding its breadth and extent, and it's only with that basic level of information that we can start to set priorities. And in Antarctica, we have we're basically working in a state of triage where we have limited resources, and then we have this added dilemma, which is that we can only work when we can see what we're doing in the austral summer. So we end up having to deploy relatively scant resources within a very small window of opportunity, and we have to be quite strategic about that. So any tools that help us get more bang for the buck with those limited resources that we have some value. So what I've been advocating for with this assessment tool is just a place to begin. It's not meant to provide a perfect solution. It's simply meant to provide a place for managers of multiple sites to start to be in action.
Yeah, thank you, Gord. And both of you, Marcy and Gord, have reflected on why it's so important that we really embrace the question and embrace the sort of understanding. And I think it's worth bringing in just the concept of heritage significance here, because in the heritage space, we are used to thinking about heritage significance as a way of managing change, and a way of managing priority as well. And Hannah, maybe I can bring you in here to perhaps think about how can we work with sort of concepts of significance and also concepts of spirit of place to help us decide what sort of qualities, tangible or intangible, give a site meaning, and how these can be maintained or carried forward when we're operating in a system of a sort of a situation of environmental change.
Yeah, I think I'm speaking to the policy point that Marcy made. Our heritage policy is generally one that's dominated by particular characteristics of significance. So something we often call evidential value, the information that's held, the record of past lives and actions, carries a lot of weight, and we are very adept at various systems of recognizing, communicating that significance. But sometimes what gets a little bit lost in that is actually when we're talking about heritage, these are things that we choose to pass between generations. So it's actually about people and what carries meaning for people. And we're not so adept at actually really understanding which aspects of these places, these buildings, these sites have that connection with people, have meaning for people, and how to characterize and communicate the significance of that. And I think particularly when it's that interplay, I think Marcy was alluding to, between the tangible and the intangible aspects of the heritage, which is very much this. We have an archaeologist are probably as guilty of this as anyone, the kind of obsession with the physical and the kind of physical remains, but it's never just that, it's always more than that. So we've been starting to explore some ways in which we might better understand that. There's various approaches, looking at the meaning that people derive from places, all the way through to the way it influences people's well-being. I've been working on a particular project looking at something called Culture and Heritage Capital, that's been looking at how we can start to articulate the benefits to people from heritage places and from archaeological places and structures. And when you start to do that, you start to think a little bit differently about what it is that changes when these places are affected by the impacts of climate, because it's not just the loss of the or the transformation of the physical things, it's also our relationship to those places, the different benefits and things that people have got from those places. And they're never, well, they might change. Understanding what it is that's changing or being lost helps us then think about how we manage those changes. We can't keep everything the same. Preservation is not something that is possible. And so the decisions that we make about how we manage, or indeed manage in a very loose sense of the word, these changes in these places, to take account of the benefits that people get from them, becomes quite complex. And we've been looking at that in particular with some work that I've been involved with a colleague Caitlin De Silva at the University of Exeter, and my colleague Ingrid Samuels at National Trust, looking at how we manage loss and transformation, and a concept of adaptive release which we developed, which was about how you hold those different benefits to people of a place and how those change to make informed decisions that might enable us to maintain that kind of connection as somewhere changes, not just letting something go or sort of giving up because something's changed and lost. And actually, as an archaeologist, nothing's ever really lost. When we excavate somewhere, it's gone. But we have the records of that. We have the ability to re-investigate, re-understand, and re-engage, and retell those stories, and use that understanding. So there's definitely something much more complex about that relationship between the physical and the knowledge and understanding and ways of knowing and understanding those places that we have and could have, which I think gives a lot of hope actually for how we can navigate these things that are really discombobulating to our normal ways of caring for heritage in these places.
Yeah, there's such a a lot of rich material in your answer there, Hannah, touching on loss and also what it means for communities. And I know that these are topics that we're all grappling with, and perhaps we can just stick with some of these for a bit longer. Marcy, I'd love to invite your sort of commentary really on how communities can play a part in our understanding of both sort of what makes a place special and also how might we cope with loss.
Yes, absolutely. I have two examples or ways of thinking that have come to mind. So I will try to share these. One is that if you can tell from my voice and also my biography, I'm from the US, and there's a lot that's happening there right now. And I'm in Sweden in part because of what's happening in the US. And so I'm watching from afar. And as I said before, like, I want heritage to sort of be part of how we respond to climate change, and it should be part of how we adapt. And I know I've said this in a number of places and a number of times, and usually what ends up being reflected back to me is something that's very tangible, sort of like what Hannah said is, oh, it's the very tangible thing. We will we'll look at maybe danger from flooding or something like that. And I was like, well, that's not quite what I mean. I want something fuller, the nature of communities. And I don't want to be fully political about it, but one of the things that has been so heartwarming to me watching the response of so many American communities to what is happening here is how so many communities have responded, but they have responded with in ways that reflect the personality of that place. So this is one, frogs in Portland. Portland has this motto, keep Portland weird. So this just sort of captures the local character. And then I had another photo, if we're able to bring that up, which is from Minneapolis. And they have responded in a different ways with a lot of communities and with a lot of love and community connection. And one of the statements that's been made is they live in a post-glacial landscape and community is absolutely essential here, and working together is very there. And one of the things that in seeing these responses, I've said this is the closest that I've seen to what I mean by working with heritage as part of community, what I want our heritage approaches to be, which is to be able to support community connection to place and the unique and individual characters of those places. And we can stop showing the image now, thank you. One of the places that I've seen do this most beautifully is a program in Scotland called SCAPE. And they work with coastal heritage, and they go all the way from assessing vulnerability and significance. Here's them on the coast, and then they identify communities affiliated with some of the most at-risk heritage. And then they go and work with them and ask a beautiful set of questions, saying, essentially, we cannot hold back the sea. I've heard them say, we cannot keep things as they are, but we can help you carry forward some of what matters about this place. What would you like that to be? And then they go and do a whole range of things to carry that forward. And so one of the things that I think is I hope is in our future, what I would like to help create is this sense of having a vision of what we want heritage to do is to support communities with their unique connections to place and their unique character. And then also, be able to hear that and come with a range of tools to help identify and hear and hold those conversations over and over again, and use that bag of tricks that we have to help them carry forward what matters about place.
Yeah, thank you, Marcy. It's wonderful to see those sort of examples of the community coming together. Is it also worth reflecting, and I'm looking to you here, Gord, about how we can work together with cultural values and natural values as well? What changes when we put our heritage sites within the much bigger concept of the environment in which they sit, particularly when we think about this in terms of climate change. This is really, really important for us in the Antarctic, and I think perhaps this is something that the Antarctic has to offer. Could I invite you to reflect on that, Gord? What What's the
Yeah.
intersection of cultural and natural heritage values here, and what does it mean when we're thinking about loss and change and adaptation?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. It's a really important question, and we can sort of speak about it in a couple of different ways. So, as so one of the values ultimately are an expression of what we care about. And we have different communities and they have different values. Of course, Marcy just mentioned a couple of examples of that. And Tom Dawson's project with Scape is just an amazing example of how communities can come together and they might approach what they care about differently from place to place. The Antarctic is one of the communities that we have to work with and cohabitate with and collaborate with are the scientific communities that work around the biology of the place, and it's almost always the case that the early heritage of Antarctica is located either right among or on top of important ecological values. They chose these places sometimes because of their access to food in the form of seals and penguins and other Antarctic animals. Sometimes for their access to the continent or to major glaciers, etc. But they're always in places of a lot of activity. So you get these overlapping sets of values, the cultural values and the ecological values, all entwined and in one place. And there's something in that which is really important for our new approach to these sites, because as Marcy pointed out, a lot of the policy that relates to heritage predates our awareness of climate change. And this is true of the designation of historic sites in Antarctica as well. So the lines that we drew on maps to designate specific places and protect them don't always match the circumstances that we see on site. And it's very often the case that those lines are dead wrong when it comes to understanding climate change and climate change impacts. So by thinking outside of our narrow perspective of cultural values and thinking more broadly about other sets of values, including ecological values, community values, and about the different people who use these places and tell stories about these places, we get a more wholesome context. And that's exactly what we need to understand how the sites are likely going to change in the future and how we need to be thinking about them going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And the picture that was just up on screen there is sort of a powerful example, I think, of the how we might use storytelling in our narratives. This was a site that Gordon and I visited around this time last year, but the ice shelf that you see there actually used to be connected to this island, and it was across that ice shelf that early researchers would sledge with dogs up onto the rest of the Antarctic peninsula and the continent. And of course, you can see in that picture now that that ice shelf is not connected anymore to the land, and so there's a story in that, and I think it's thinking about stories and how we engage people with what's happening is going to be crucial to our success, I suppose, as a sector. And I know it's something that we've all been thinking about, but Hannah, if I could sort of turn to you maybe to maybe reflect on the role of storytelling, but also maybe what is the heritage sector good at, and what do we have to work on to communicate these sort of important issues?
Yeah, I think it's come out a little in our discussion so far, but essentially we're about people. We've got the stories of people and their relationship with each other and with places and with the environment. And it's really relatively recently that this division between nature and peoply things. Culture, heritage has been drawn up, and it's that tension that we're sort of experiencing that's probably led us to the challenges that we're facing, we're talking about. So those stories of how people have been and existed and lived in places over time are really powerful, both at helping empowering people to use the imagination. If you can imagine a world that's very different from today, that's a hugely helpful thing for trying to think about solutions to problems. And I often say that the archaeologists are experts. We've got a number of superpowers, and one of them is time travel. So we weave those stories of people long lost and landscapes that are long lost. My particular specialism is in Pleistocene archaeology. I know Marcy has also got links to the deep past, but these are landscapes that are totally gone, often submerged, very different from what we see today. So the skills that archaeologists have to tell the stories of human existence in these places that look and feel, probably smelt very different from what we have around us today is really very powerful when you're trying to help people imagine a future that's also very different. So I think that's that power of time travel is quite strong. And I think also it's hard to engage with these changes. We have a very, as people, we're very selfish. We like to think about people. We like stories about other people, and we are centered around people. And the heritage sector and archaeology in particular is about the what is it that people were doing in these places in the past, and that gives a familiarity and a point of reference for things that might feel otherwise very distant and hard to comprehend. And it's much easier to think through what people have been experiencing and doing, rather than just a world without people in which we're no longer there. And quite frankly, we're not going to address the challenges that we face today without people. So it's really important that the narratives and the way in which we communicate and explore ideas around this do involve people, because we have to be part of the solution. We can't find a way through without involving people in this process.
Absolutely, and that really brings us back to one of the points you made at the start there, Marcy, which is on how is heritage part of the solution, and how can we make it part of how we talk about climate change and its negative impacts, but move it towards an active solution in this dialogue. Marcy, perhaps, is there examples that you can think of to maybe take us into a bit more detail as heritage acting as a sort of driver of opportunity or sustainability rather than simply a casualty?
Yeah, I'm going to pull on one part of your question that you've just asked about sort of moving forward, because I want to link some of my work to the places that you and Gord have been, and what we've just been seeing down in Antarctica. Back when I was with the U.S. National Park Service, quite early on, I was encouraged to come up with a sort of splashy idea around heritage and climate in the event that someone higher up than me wanted to make a big statement. And one of the ideas that I came up with was to actually designate the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii as a National Historic Landmark. And you can see it now on the screen. And I had the chance to go out there. This is my photo. And I spoke with several of the folks there and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that runs it. And what was so interesting is they said they were honored with the idea that they might qualify as a National Historic Landmark. They also had concerns, and I think this will resonate given all of our conversations so far, that such a designation, it needed to not interfere with their ability to do their work, which I thought was really important. That's a reflection on the policy that we've had for such a long time. But really, the idea that this place where the Keeling curve was started, where those direct measurements of atmospheric CO2, really took shape, that really power, I'm going like this because the powerful curve going up, that this is where that knowledge and that data has been gathered for so long using they still have the machine there, the building is named that, so forth, that this place has a story to tell. And as Hannah was saying, like every place that is a heritage place, any part of heritage that we designate, we can connect that with climate change because it's part of how humans live in the environment. But the Mauna Loa Observatory is a place where sort of climate science, our ability to change the atmosphere and the history of doing that, that's where they all touch. And as I am learning more about Antarctica and where GORD and the Antarctic Trust are doing, Antarctica is also one of those places. And so I'm starting to think about how we might start to connect these different places around the world where these connections of climate science and place and story and our ability to see and measure this change touch. And I will share one other idea with you. I have been working for a number of years with the group called the International Coalition for Sites of Conscience, which work with places with difficult history and memory, and they have started to build methods of dialogue around difficult places. And one of my mad ideas is that we connect that with climate change and start to build our ability to talk about these stories. And I think these different places where heritage and climate and science and space touch could be a focus of that. So that's, I think I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I've sort of gone in a long round direction.
That's wonderful, all these wonderful connections, and I think a lot of points all speaking to one another here, and beginning I think for us to think about what comes next and what innovations are happening or what innovations could happen to try and make this discussion both more powerful and more meaningful and more active. Gord, just as we're sort of vaguely coming to the end of our panel discussion, before we field a few questions from the audience, so please do put your questions in if they're coming to you. But as we're wrapping up, Gord, could you reflect a little bit on, what do you think we need to do to accelerate progress in thinking about responding to climate change in the heritage sector? What sort of support or research or investment is needed next?
Yeah, well, that's an important question. I think something that Marcy just said about opportunities provides part of the answer. We certainly need to be more collaborative in the way we approach cultural heritage, and I think that's true generally. We just get to see an exaggerated version of that in the Antarctic. The history of these places that we care for have a tremendous opportunity in them because they're the sites of the earliest human interventions on an otherwise pristine continent. And so we have the opportunity to contribute to really quite valuable science about how humans change the world that we live in. And also they tend to be repositories of information captured at the time they were first created. So we can look at the sites around them and at the information held within the cultural heritage. And we have a really powerful measurement tool for how sites have changed. And I say that because I was looking at that photograph that you were speaking to earlier with the receding glacier, and it's true that for many of the places that we work at, the sites would now be unrecognizable to the people who first inhabited them or built them. The landscape is changing just so terribly quickly now. But we also like to answer your question about where do we go and what should we focus on. I think we really need to focus on broader collaboration with our colleagues who have previously been siloed. Science is one sort of easy example, but in Antarctica, one of the main user groups are visitors and tourist visitors. And there's an opportunity there too, because there's an awful lot of them, and they get to go to all sorts of places that conservators of cultural sites don't. So that represents an opportunity too. If we can if we can find more ways to engage with those larger communities who have so much access to so many places that we don't get to go to, then we'll take a huge step forward. And SCAPE is an example of how that's happening in the UK. We can do that in the Antarctic as well.
Thank you, Cord. I'm really keen that our audience gets the chance to hear from our speakers in response to some of their specific questions. So perhaps we can take a few questions now from the audience. This is right. Here's one on the screen. So it is. Preservation and conservation aren't necessarily the same thing. I think that too many people outside heritage professionals won't understand the difference. How do we change that for the public? That's a really great question. Hannah, would you like to address that?
Yeah, that's quite a challenge, isn't it? But there's often I also think it's worth mentioning that these are terms that are used in different ways in different countries and in different communities, actually. So I know in the UK and in National Trust in particular, we have a lot of conversations about conservation. So we're the biggest conservation charity in Europe, actually probably the world, but we cover both nature conservation and heritage conservation, both of which carry slightly different meanings. Essentially, it's the caring for things and the careful management of change. That's how we would most commonly describe that. There is a particularly interesting ruling in relation to a place on the south coast of England, which is experiencing coastal change and coastal erosion, where I think that the judge ruled in a challenge that the place needed to be protected in order to prevent coastal erosion. That actually it's a site of special scientific interest for geological interest. And the ruling determined that actually those natural processes that allowed for the constant eroding of that cliff face were incredibly important part of the conservation of that site, that were you to prevent them, you would lose that geological interest that meant the constant re-exposure of the section through time. And I think that's probably quite a nice example of a way that something that is very much not preservation is actually conservation. So that the sort of careful management of change and allowing of those natural processes in that place is very much part of that. But I think also it's just communication and sharing are the challenges and the conversations that we have. There aren't single right answers to these, and that's also that dialogue discussion is very much part of that process of conservation.
Thank you, Hannah. Can we have our next question, please? Oh, hi, Claire. So this is Claire from the Government of British Antarctic Territory with two questions. So the first one, I think I'll address specifically to Gord. And then the second question, I think maybe there's something that everybody has to say about that. So the first question for Gord, where do you see the future of the tool going?
Well, thanks for the question. So the tool as it's designed right now is intended for preliminary assessment. And we've just completed, as part of the work that we've been doing, an assessment of all of the historic sites and monuments in British Antarctic Territory. This is the first time that this has been done. So we can use the tool to create some very high level snapshot views of what's happening in large regions which have multiple sites, and then build a dialogue, use it as a tool to support dialogue around priority setting. One of the feedbacks that we have had from the managers of sites is that they would love to be able to take that tool and then add context that only they may be able to offer. So to use it as a more specialized or strategic tool for the management of individual sites or groups of sites. And that's where the tool goes next. So we're currently building those functions and the ability to share reports and collaborate into the way it works, which will basically give managers of sites the opportunity to put their finger on the scale and adjust risk ratings based on things that they know about the site or can observe to be happening.
Great. And I'll also say that the tool itself will be online, we hope, in the very near future. So hopefully will be accessible from www.ukaht.org in maybe a month, hopefully a bit less. So do check out our website to have a go. And whilst that is at the moment just focused on Antarctica, I think it's worth having a look anyway, because it looks at what are the particular vulnerabilities of a site that could be applicable in a much wider space. So do take a look. And then this final question, Claire, is a great one. You know, if you were running, if we could just put our hat, or sort of imaginative hat, on for a second, if we were running the government for the day, what would we do to prioritise heritage? So looking at all three of you, is there anybody that would feels they have a ready answer for this? Would like to speak up? Yes, Marcy, please do.
So I have two ideas. I know in the US we have a particular challenge in that the primary agency for heritage doesn't have that in its name. It's the National Park Service. And most people think of the Park Service as being sort of Yellowstone and the big nature parks. And so heritage is effectively invisible. So I would like to do something to make heritage more visible and more aware. But I would also like to, and I think Gord mentioned this, tackle some of the silos that have built up and start to rearrange some of those silos or build bridges between them and really co-locate the people who know and work with heritage and people who know and work with natural systems and put them more closely together so that we can start to work more closely between them.
Quite so.
That's great. Thank you, Marcy.
Yep.
Shall we have another question? Oh, tool. So this is a reference to the project that Gord's been working on that we referenced at the beginning of this discussion, which is a climate change risk assessment tool. And Gord, maybe you can just explain in just a couple of minutes what that actually looks like. How do people use it? What does it ask? What are the questions? How do you assess vulnerability?
So we've created an online interactive tool, which is, as Ruth said, it's going to be available through the UKAHT website soon, probably within the next number of weeks. And when a user first opens it up, they can choose from drop-down menus of existing Antarctic protected areas of different types. So the entire database of all protected areas is there to choose from. We can also use undesignated sites. So the tool works equally well for an as yet designated site. And then there's a place to load some information, photographs, maps, etc. And then there's a series of 11 questions which the website prompts users to answer with yes or no questions. And while and these questions run the gamut from where the site might be located, how close it is or far away from the Antarctic Circle, for example, and what the nature of the values of the site consist of, whether they're more or less durable, how close, whether it's a coastal site, how close it is to the sea. This image that you're looking at here is a slope assessment from one of the sites that Ruth and I were on earlier. And we know that sites with steeper slopes are more vulnerable to change, especially when the soils are permafrost. And then with that information input into the tool, it will produce a relative risk value, and users can save that information. They can also produce reports or share it with others so that when they come and go from the website in the future, they can build up their own library and resource for their own use.
Thank you, Gord. And I think we have time for just probably one more question. We can get one final question up on the screen, please. Okay, so what are the extra struggles that the heritage sector is facing in this very complicated geopolitical landscape at the moment? Now, I think this is a pressing question for all of us. I suspect, Marcy, you've been giving this an awful lot of thought. Would you like to respond to this?
I will give it a try. I think where I come at is, I think, Ruth, as you mentioned earlier, and all of us have experienced so much of the world of heritage. For so long, we never have enough funding. We always talk about the gaps and the constraints of what we do. And I know that I sort of grew up, if you will, in the profession being told heritage just doesn't matter very much. You should be small. You're the smaller program. You're not connected to things. You're not what it matters. You should learn to do more with less, and all of that. And I think what we are seeing, I know particularly struggles in the US and some of the larger events that are happening, is that in fact, heritage and history matter a great deal. It is in fact very, very important. And that doesn't, I don't mean to dilute or diminish what is happening, but to say that history and heritage and how we tell these stories and how we engage with it and how we work with it is very important. And we should not be shy about seeing that talking about history and heritage as part of climate and our larger struggles. Like this is part of it, and we should do that. And this work is important. So I think that is what I'm taking from this, and what I hope all of us can take with it is that additional boost of saying this does matter and how we work with it does matter.
That's a really lovely way to end our questions there. Thank you, Marcy. Yeah. And I'd like to end the webinar here by just inviting a few final reflections from our speakers before we disappear, to just summarize some of the thoughts we've had about today. So my question for each of you is if you could share just one idea or challenge or opportunity that you think should guide the heritage sector's climate change response over the next decade, what would it be? And if I put that question first to Gord, because he's laughing.
Well, I simply put, I'd say get on with it. As conservators of cultural heritage, we're trained from the very early days to be slow and thoughtful and considered and careful, and that right now in the context of rapid and quite substantial climate change impacts on our sites doesn't cut it. We know what a slow and thoughtful approach will result in. It will result in a greater degree of loss. So I just think, we need to roll our sleeves up and get busy and really be prepared to work with imperfect solutions and trust that we'll figure it out along the way. We will, but let's not hesitate to be in action.
Thank you, Gord. And to you, Marcy?
I think there's an arc I think we've already started to follow in this conversation, where we sort of started with impacts and loss and understanding the physical consequences of what's happening. But then we've talked about community and connection and hope and directions that we go. And I think several of us have mentioned the SCAPE projects, and I want to close by mentioning one of the powerful things that I've seen them do, because they start their conversations not by talking about greenhouse gas emissions or coastal erosion or sea level rise and all of that. They start by saying, what is the story of this place? What matters here? What do you care about? And I have seen the conversations that start with those questions just go in very, very different directions from all of the other climate change conversations that I've been in. And so I think the opportunity that I see the heritage world is having is building on that. I absolutely hear Gord, and I'm like, get on with it, but also keep asking that question of as many communities as we can, saying, what matters here? What matters to you? What are the stories that you have? What are your connections to this place? And where do you want to go? Because I think that if we lean into that, that builds hope and energy and hopefully more capacity to do new things.
Thank you, Marcy. And then finally, to you, Hannah.
Yeah, I think building on that, the question that I'm posing to my archaeological colleagues at the moment is, we're very often asked about, what's special here, what should we avoid, what should we protect? And actually, the question is, what could we help people know or understand about a place that can help? So we're facing unprecedented challenges. It's a scary place, but we bring real hope, and we have knowledge that can genuinely help. And if you stop and think, each of us who work in this sector, what is it that we know or could help people know? And the audience isn't us. The audience is other people, and thinking about how we share what we know with people who are outside of our sector is how that knowledge becomes used and useful and part of that solution.
Thank you, Hannah. So our key takeaway messages for everybody to go home with tonight are: get on with it, to ask questions in communities of people of what matters to them, and then also to communicate with helping people understand messages about a place. That's it. Thank you all to our speakers for joining us tonight, for making this panel so thought-provoking and engaging. Your sort of comments have been really appreciated. Thank you to the Green Overseas Programme for your support for this webinar and for the work that Gordon and I have been working on. And please do stay connected with the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust. Feel free to check out our previous webinars on our YouTube channel and to follow along on our socials. And have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you.